How are you doing?
I'm better. I had bronchitis for almost 2 weeks.
Oh,
I was sick. Just a little bit of lingering things. Yeah.
Glad you're doing better.
Oh, yeah. It's night and day. Take antibiotics and steroids and Robitussin and everything else you can imagine. Don't get out of your pajamas for about 7 or 8 days.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that must have been real bad. Sorry to hear that. But I'm glad you're here.
Well,
Yeah.
at least for maybe 30 minutes in the washer and dryer, but.
Do what now?
Your pajamas.
Oh, no, I didn't get out of my pajamas for 7 or 8 days.
Oh, my God.
No, I just sat in my kitchen in the sunlight till the sun went down.
Baking.
I was sick.
You have the windows open now?
Windows.
I had way too many flyovers, so I'm good. I'm ready to land.
Oh,
Boom, I'm down.
okay.
All right. So chapter 8, respecting the chain of custody.
Oh,
Giving them wrong information again?
no.
Just kidding.
On the mushrooms this morning.
The back pain really hurts.
I only took some ibuprofen in a couple of days. That was just so I could go to work.
It wasn't back in the day when they were puncturing the tops of aspirin bottles and injecting arsenic. And that's why we got all the child-proof containers and the double wrap over. If you see a puncture mark in it, you don't buy it.
I didn't know that.
Mass murders.
Yeah. Dang, that's horrible.
People did die from that. I remember.
Oh, they did. That was a big one. They wiped all that off the shelves. There was nothing until they figured out what that's and all that.
Wow.
Yeah, evil at work trying to protect us.
Right. So in chapter 8, it talks about chain of custody. So in a court case, all the evidence, it's very meticulously entered and cataloged. So from the beginning, you have the police officers, they find things, and then inspectors come and they bag them and tag them. And then they take them back to the compound and they log them and put them back in the back room. And every time somebody has to take it out, they have to sign for it. So you can see, they went in, went out, so there's no tampering with the evidence. So that's the chain of custody. All right, so to prove that a defendant is part of a felonious conspiracy, prosecutors, defense attorneys sometimes insinuate an officer has planted evidence in a case. In order to prove such an accusation, however, it must be demonstrated that when the officer willfully and intentionally changed, planted, placed, made, hid, or moved a piece of evidence. 2, that the officer knew he or she was changing, planting, placing, making, hiding, or moving a piece of evidence. And 3, when the officer changed, placed, planted, made, hid, or moved a piece of evidence, he or she intended that his or her action would result in someone being charged with a crime, or the piece of evidence would be wrongfully produced as genuine or true in a court proceeding. So he was talking about, in his example, the button.
Yeah.
And then the only the evidence they have for the button besides the button itself was a picture of the button. But since it was 30 years ago, the picture was really blurry. So the defense attorney was trying to say, well, how do you know that that's actually a picture of the button? How can we know for sure that that's a real piece of evidence and you're just not planting it? And so we can know that through the chain of custody, through all the evidence. There wasn't just a button someone just randomly threw in at a certain point in time. Right?
Or the defense was claiming that maybe the officer took it off the guy's shirt that they were suspecting and planted it.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, the gun on the, ankle routine. That was his. Yeah.
So, establishing a chain of custody. Oop, too far. All right, so from the crime scene to the courtroom. All right, so we have the officer, and then the crime scene investigator, detectives, criminalist, second criminalist, cold case detective, and then the courtroom. So there's a lot that goes into that. And it's all documented and it's all there so you can see it.
And if the glove doesn't fit, you must quit.
Yeah.
That was a
Yeah, he talks.
long court trial, watching all kind of stuff going on in that one.
Yeah, they actually talk about that.
Mhm.
And I was young when that happened, so I don't remember details. So it's interesting reading what happened. So he says Simpson was accused of killing Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, and his defense team claimed the police tampered with evidence to implicate him. LAPD detective Mark Furham testified that he found a bloodstained glove at the location where Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered. He also testified he traveled to O.J. Simpson's home later in the evening and found the matching bloodstained glove at the estate. So the defense argued Furham transported the items from the scene of the murder and planted them at Simpson's residence. The chain of custody was at the center of the defense's argument. That's interesting. Did he actually travel from scene to the house with the glove in the car?
You know, I don't remember, but didn't Furman get found out to be lying at a particular point? I didn't follow it very well at all, but it seems like, looking at you guys, didn't Furman, wasn't he lying
No,
at one point?
he was,
Or did he tell the truth? I don't remember.
yeah, I don't think he was accused of lying but the big thing was that he was accused of racism. And, he had made some statements previous to that.
Was that in?
Racism. They used that trying to convince the jury that apparently they did convince the jury that racism caused them trying O.J. Simpson.
I
He was
just don't
trying to
remember.
protect his wife from making a bad drug deal with a criminal known to kind of like blank you out if you don't take care of your business. And so trying to get her stay out of the limelight and everything else. I mean, OJ didn't know half the things that she was doing. That really convoluted.
Well,
There's a company that's a good documentation out there about it. Ways on their outcome.
The interesting thing that made the chain of custody came to light in the 2020 election. Ballots and stuff. That's the first time I had really paid much attention to the concept. There was very little authentication of chain of custody of a lot of the ballots. So that's kind of, like that, I hadn't paid attention to that or thought much about that until that kind of took on.
We actually use them at work. So I work for a water company, and our samples that we send off to labs and to the state to get tested for things like PFAS, PFAS, PFOA. We have a chain of custody, so we can see this is where it left, this is where it went, then we got it back. So
we used to do that in the department where I work with asbestos.
yeah,
When you took the sample, who got it, who sent it.
yeah, it's important.
Yeah, a friend of ours, an engineer for blowing and assessment. They every nut and bolt and screw and everything in the chain to go from the manufacturer.
Really?
For
It's really tedious.
Yeah.
But when you,
He was making a bracket for a seat on an airplane. And it took him 2 years between the initial design request and the actual production for the interior components. 2 years. Because of all the documentation, testing, authorization.
comes in handy though when you're like, oh,
What happened?
Yeah, see what-
Well, like this, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I was gonna say, like this picture that Randy was showing us, when you think about a cold case that might last, well, like the John Bonet, 28 years, making sure the chain of custody was maintained throughout that entire amount of time. That's no easy task, I would imagine.
Especially when they have stuff from very beginning. They never had it come in. They messed up from the whole thing, same.
yeah, and then,
Trampling all over the front yard and onto the house before anybody get there with pictures and lay down the numbers. Move the old town box.
Really? I haven't followed it.
and then with cold cases or anything over a long period of time, you have evidence that gets damaged or missing or lost. So you have to deal with that as well. The good thing though for us is we have a wealth of evidence for the New Testament.
And this chapter is kind of short on application.
Yes. Yeah, I was talking with John about that. And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to come up with some stuff. So they actually, in chapter 13, they revisit this in more detail. So it's like, should we go to 13 or should we just? So we do have 2 videos today. So
Intermission.
and if we finish early, we can go see the kids.
Well, they finish up early too.
Yeah.
Right?
So Christ died in 33 in the Council of Laodicea is when they canonized the New Testament. So he used that example of the life of Jesus as the event, right, or the crime scene, and then the Council of Laodicea as the courtroom. So we had 330 years, roughly, of what about the evidence between that point, right? So he talks about are there unsuspecting believers and unsuspecting lying authors, and give some examples. But like Scott just mentioned, he doesn't give a lot of application of this, so the videos will give more light to that. But what we can look at is evidence, history, and reasonable expectations. So we have the apostolic eyewitnesses, the disciple of the apostles, the disciples of the disciples, the early church fathers, and then so on and so forth. So we do have, I wish he would have gone into this, and he will in chapter 13, but we do have a chain of custody per se for the New Testament. And the wealth of manuscripts we have and the writings from the early church fathers and the direct links from the disciples of the apostle Ignatius and all the other church fathers in the 1st century and 2nd century. And then their disciples, they're referencing each other and talking about each other, and we have it in writing. And then outside sources as well that are talking about these events. So non-Christian authors and Jewish historians, Josephus, and I don't know if you guys are here. We had, might have been that Easter month. He put on the big screen a ton of different external references, extra biblical references for evidence for resurrection and everything that happened. That was cool. So Tula gives her call out bag, says we would be wise to have at least some understanding of the identity of the students and disciples of the apostles and some mastery of their writings. Many of these named men, like Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement, became known as the early church fathers. They are worth our time and effort, particularly as we make a case for the New Testament chain of custody and the reliability of the Gospels as eyewitness accounts.
Have you ever read any of the stuff by Polycarp or Ignatius or Clement? I never have.
I have, but not as like I haven't gotten their actual books and read it cover to cover, the letters. I've read parts and pieces that people use elsewhere.
I've read quotes from Josephus, you
Yeah.
know, when it talks about him referencing him, but I don't think I've read any of the early church fathers. Any of you?
Yeah, I'd like to get their actual like their full books and their early books, but the compilations of their writings and their letters and whatnot, that would be cool.
Mm-hmm.
And even some of the Apocrypha, but then you got to be careful reading the Apocrypha. There is some good historical information in that. The Apocrypha, or another name is the Deuterocanonical books. So at the time of the Council of Laodicea, when they were canonizing or setting in stone the New Testament scriptures, there were other books. Some of these other books that we don't have are those, and they call them Apocrypha or apocryphal books. So some of them are just crazy. Others do have good historical information in them. A good example is like the Book of Maccabees.
Mm-hmm.
Catholics have those in their Bible. We don't, but you can look at the history in there, and that's like Hanukkah. That comes from that history, so you can learn about where Hanukkah came from, the story of Maccabee and the Maccabean revolt. So it has lots of good information in it, but it didn't fit their description or make the cut for the canon. All the different books that they put in had to have they had a category, had to have eyewitnesses of Jesus or a direct link back to Jesus and his resurrection and his ministry.
Like the books of the Apocrypha.
They almost have standalone elements of the story of some, but they didn't really fit with main biblical story.
Yeah, so some of them are. Go ahead.
Various reasons that they didn't, weren't accepted in the kingdom. Some of them were just, factually wrong and conflict.
Then next to Mr. Bean's books and schools that he lost.
Would have been like some of them that I like.
Yeah.
It's like they had the idea of the story, but then there was a
Yeah.
centurion Britain,
Yeah. Like
influence from whatever culture around them.
Right.
Like a lot of them have things that conflict with the rest of the Bible. Like the Book of Enoch has things that were true, then it can directly contradicts other things in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of them were just written by other pagan religions and Gnosticists and whatnot, and just claiming kind of like the different books of Mormon, right?
Right.
Throughout thousands of years, they're going to have these books that just pop up, and they're going to claim they're Messiah or I'm a messenger of God, and
Yeah.
they'll have similar elements,
Mm-hmm.
but they contradict.
Same with the other one.
Yeah.
Foundation was similar, and then it was like, diverse.
Yeah.
Just when the price is really,
One thing that's interesting about the Islam is their doctrine states that the later writings are more authoritative than the early writings.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they will use the early writings to talk about peace and all this, and then the later writings to talk about, death and destruction and conquering. They're the ones that actually have authority. And they reference these in order to distort and lie.
Yeah, they say.
Shiites and all that, it was like
No, just who has the right
Yeah.
to,
Okay.
very interesting foundation with which to
Yeah.
trust on.
Mhm.
So that's why people are like, I can tell all the time. But they leave you alone and
Well, wasn't that kind of prophetic that they would be crazy people?
Oh,
I'm not mocking, but wasn't that one of the, either the blessing or something, would be like a wild ass or something like that? And you look at just the temperament
Mm-hmm.
of a general broad category.
Yeah.
And it tends to be, I mean, you write a cartoon about Muhammad, and the emotions that come out of that are
Right.
just beyond the norm. Or that's my observation.
Yeah, if they have a word for that, what you were talking about with Muslims, and they changes. Basically, they're saying God can change his mind.
Hmm.
And things he said before are no longer relevant.
Interesting.
There's a word they have it in a distinct. This is what we call it.
I'm looking up to see if you can find anything by Polycarp. I'm interested now.
Oh yeah.
What is it? I'm
That's
always
translating the word.
kind of curious about
Yeah.
that name, you know, it's like many fish. or
Yeah.
Many
Yeah.
scum suckers.
The mini
or,
bottom feeders.
They do Polycarp of Smyrna, the epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. With that, because he's talking about that we should become familiar. I remember noticing that when I was reading this, and then again noticing up there that he's saying as part of our call out list, we should be able to articulate what some of the early fathers are saying. And I never thought about looking at what they're saying. Here's the epistles of Clement, Matthias, Polycarp, and Ignatius. I just might order that.
Yeah, I think they're definitely not necessary, right, for salvation or walk, but I think they're helpful tools. Right, the Bible says in the Bible that his word is everything we need to live a godly life. That doesn't mean that's the only thing we should or can read. There are very helpful tools. Like this book is a helpful tool that we're reading.
Great. Yes, this is very helpful. You know, I wish I remembered as much as I read.
Yeah,
No, I'm serious.
I've forgotten more
I
stuff
read
than.
it.
Oh, yeah.
I usually read it twice. I listen to what you and John say, and the way you're able to recall facts from other series, from other books. I'm always impressed by that, because my recollection of what I read, I don't know if I read too fast.
No, it's just being, just the way of reading it.
You
Mhm.
think so?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think we've forgotten so much more than we know.
Yeah, we're,
Yeah.
super, you only retain like 2-3% of the cap and read.
Really?
Yeah, right?
And the stuff we do remember doesn't have quite an impact. Like certain events could happen. Like if we look at the Israelites throughout the Old Testament, they saw miracles, and the Red Sea split. God took care of them and provided manna and water miraculously. You know,
The thing about like in the book, there's so many words in there that are just structuring how to tell you what they're trying to tell you instead of the main point. So like you're trying to grasp concept in 800 words instead of a one sentence. Yeah, I can remember that sentence.
Yeah.
I can't remember the 800 other ones that you put in those because they're just everyday words and everyday examples of it. But it's a lot of extra.
Sometimes
Yeah.
Some people have that.
Oh yeah, look at examples.
sometimes those 800 words, though, clarify a concept that you could never put into a sentence.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's both sides of that.
and same thing.
So I'll never remember like the quote for it, but I'll remember the concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what it was. I couldn't tell you where it was written, what the verse is, but I remember that.
Yeah, same thing. And just with the Bible, we so often remember just verses, and a lot of times verses they'll make complete worldviews or thought processes on verses.
Right.
But you read them in the context, the author's not talking about that at all.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's to your point of the issue with that helps in the context. But yeah, it's not for your salvation, but in our Western modern mindsets, what were they thinking 800, 1,000 years ago? So it helps you get back into it. Even though the translation you may read isn't gonna be 100% accurate to what they may have been trying to convey,
Well, I just ordered it.
but it's
because-
still a big year jump behind and say, oh, that's a complete different mindset. Thank you.
Well, it'll be interesting when he says the epistle to the Philippians. And I keep wanting, just because of a knowledge base, I've been told not to read it, but I'd like to read the Apocrypha. You know, I know what they say about Maccabees, but there's the Babel, or, you know, there's just a lot of other books that I've heard. And I've heard you don't want to put that into your mind, you know, why put false information? But I'm just curious about it.
I would,
Well, that's a true statement, so you're at your own risk.
Yeah.
yeah, I would do a little bit of research about each one beforehand to see what the context of that is about, and the things that could contradict the Bible, so you know ahead of time. So you're not just reading it and then it gets melded and mixed with your worldview and your theology. And then you're like, oh, I heard that somewhere. Where did I hear that?
Yeah.
With history, having our early church fathers' writings and throughout all of history, right, I think it's super helpful. One idea I can think of immediately is, and then there's different views, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So you have cessationists. Cessationists believe that the gifts of the Holy Spirit that were given back in the day, those specific gifts, the way they were used, we don't see that today. God could still heal. He could still make people speak in native tongues that they don't know. He could do the miraculous still. Cessationists don't deny that. They don't think the gifts as they were used back in the day are here now. That they were used for that first century to build the church. Christ says that you know who I am and by what I do, right? That's paraphrasing. He's saying his miracles help prove who he is. Right? And the apostles too, and they help build the church. But after that, after the first century, all early church fathers, this is where the history part comes in, they all agree, and they're synonymous, that those gifts ceased. And they ceased up until about 100 years ago when the Pentecostals, Charles Parham, he's the father of Pentecostalism, said that they're the second Pentecost, and that's where they got their name, Pentecostals. And that the gifts are back. So the only other time we see what we call now speaking in tongues is other religions. The Mormons did it like early mid 1800s when they were visited by a spirit, or other pagan religions do it. Hindu Kundalini religion, they have it. You can look up videos of them and they're speaking in Babel and they're shaking and all kinds of stuff. Some very similar stuff that you would see in charismatic Pentecostal or hyper charismatic churches. And you're like, you have Catholics and Mormons and all these people say they speak in tongues, yet that the gift of tongues is from the Holy Spirit. How is it that Mormons have a completely doctrine that's different? How can they have that? It's just something to think
You're
about,
always
right?
supposed to have an interpreter too.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
But then you have continuists on the other side. They believe that those gifts are current for today.
Well, I'll tell you what, I sounded a lot of like that garbage when I had to much to There's Michael, always speaking in tongues on the middle of the road out there. They have to come get him.
That's where the history part comes in. That's super valuable. I grew up charismatic. Everyone I knew spoke in tongues and they did crazy stuff and they laid hands and they had the ushers that would fall behind, catch you. And so I grew up in it, but I never spoke in tongues. And I'm like, now that I'm older and I'm doing my research and I got the history behind it as well, the early church fathers and leaders all throughout the last 1900 years, they all agree those gifts ceased. So it's like, okay, so all church history, they say it ceased. Now all of a sudden, the last 100 years, they're back. Right. That's a whole study by itself, but that's where an example of having history like this is helpful.
So,
So we're gonna watch this video. I might put the sound on my laptop because it started to cut out. I'm gonna see if it's just the TV link. Or maybe me.
You got metal in your hand or something.
Yeah.
You know, you're creating an antenna, that's what you're doing.
Yeah. Oh, I muted it too. That doesn't help. I'll put up there. Let me find out where we left off. I should have looked this up. I pulled up the other video we're gonna watch, and I totally forgot about this one.
Oh.
So this is the one that's
Why-
split into
I was
two?
wondering why it was backing up in time, it's like.
Yeah.
Oh, no. That's the right thing to happen.
Is it? It's resist conspiracy theories. Yeah.
That's the next chapter, yeah.
It was the previous.
It says when enough is
Yeah.
enough.
Is he going into the chapter
it
9?
looks like he was doing 79.
Okay. Well, that's weird. Remember this.
Yeah.
Here it is. He completely skips it. Okay. So that's what the other video I have is. Oh. That's kind of weird.
That would probably be a weakness that I would have. When is enough enough? You know, I mean, I haven't been except in that small jury, but just thinking about that, at what point would I really feel I had reasonable amount of information?
Well, I won't get too far. So that's next. John sent me this video. We were chit-chatting. So this is the actual chain of custody one, but it's pulled out because the way he lays out the book is different from. This is from the deeper study. Or the different book or whatever it was.
Non-10th anniversary.
Case, what do they call it? Case makers? The case makers course. It has different versions of it. So it's weird. It's like the first 3 videos, it lines up with this book. First 2 chapters per video, and then this one I should have checked. Oh, mercy.
Let's take a look at our timeline again from the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus,
Can you do
those
that?
3 years where he's on planet Earth, and he's been on planet Earth for 33 years, but those 3 years are the 3 years of his ministry. Let's take a look at those 3 years of public ministry and ask the question, has it changed? By the time we get to the council, that's 330 years later. Does the story change over time? Something similar as often claimed about crime scenes. So I'll give you a crime scene here, and then some time passes, let's say 30 years between the actual crime and the time we finally get to trial. And there's a piece of evidence that is collected on the day of the crime that I then, here it is, it's this casing you can see in the crime scene. I'm going to bring this into trial 30 years later, and I'm going to argue that this is an important piece of evidence because there's an extractor pin mark on the casing that matches the extractor pin in the suspect's gun, automatic pistol. And so he has an extractor pin mark. And so I just need to know, is that this is evidence that this casing came from his handgun. But I think it's fair that somebody could ask, well, how do I know that that casing wasn't pulled out of property 10 years later, 10 years after the fact, and some clever detective etched on the casing a mark that matches or seems to match the extractor pin? How do I know that's a legitimate mark from the day of the crime and wasn't just added later? And then, by the way, when that finally got to the crime lab, a decade after the fact, they didn't realize that it had been changed by a detective who pulled it out of property. And then by the time I get to it, I have no idea that it had been changed. So now I have a piece of tampered evidence in my evidence set. It's not exactly as it was in the crime scene. Couldn't something similar happen in history when it comes to the Gospels? Maybe there is some account of Jesus, but by the time it gets into the council, 330 years later, it's been changed. And I mean, it's been changed hundreds of times perhaps because there's been 330 years to work with. So by the time somebody brings it into the council, they're just like me. They don't know that it has been changed. They don't know that they have tampered evidence. They are kind of just thinking it's regular, it's actually legitimate, when in fact it has been changed over time. Do you see the problem here? This is the problem that's described by Bart Ehrman in his book, How Jesus Became God. He believes the simple version of Jesus as a itinerant preacher, preaching rabbi, was changed until the Jesus of history became the Christ of Christianity. This is the claim, that the story of Jesus was changed over time, the same way that casing was changed over time. Well, how do we check this thing in criminal trials? Well, we ask the question, was there an officer on the day this was collected who saw the casing and maybe he took a Polaroid? That's an old camera that used to take immediate pictures, kind of like your phone, but before we had phones. So if there's somebody who maybe he even wrote a report, a supplemental report, and maybe his image plus the report mentioned the extractor pin mark in some way. Well, if that's the case, we'd have a record of that extractor pin mark being very early in history, very early, actually at the point of the discovery of the casing. And then if somebody like my dad, back in the day when my dad was working as a detective, if he took another Polaroid when he received this from the officer or wrote an additional report, maybe he would even reiterate what had been seen earlier. And then by the time he brings it to the crime lab, now they're taking comprehensive photographs and reports. And by the time I pick it up, I even write a report of what I'm collecting from the crime lab. Well, now you've got report after report after report, picture after picture after picture over time, tracing the piece of evidence to see if it's changed. We call this, because each person in this sequence is like a link in a chain connecting the past to the present. We call this the chain of custody. And for every significant piece of evidence in a criminal trial, you will have to show the chain of custody. Who touched it? Where did it go next? Did it change over time? Well, is there a chain of custody for the New Testament? Yeah, there is. I'm going to show you one. For example, we'll start, let's say, with John's Gospel. We have a crime scene. This is the life and ministry of Jesus. We have a trial, which is what is called the church councils. So the question is, who is the first officer on the scene who saw something about Jesus and recorded it? So we'll use for this first example, John. So the question then becomes, John writes a gospel, but how do we know what's in the gospel? For all we know, the story gets corrupted over time. Maybe when John describes Jesus, he's a much simpler version of Jesus. No miracles, no virgin birth, no rising from the dead, just a preaching rabbi in the first century. Well, we could ask the question, who are the next officers in the chain of custody? Well, it turns out John had three personal students, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp, who sat at John's feet. Now, we can look at what their reports say. These officers also wrote reports. As a matter of fact, we have access to these because they were leaders in the local churches early in history. We, for example, can recover, there's still 7 letters that survive, in which, for example, Ignatius is quoting or describing what it is he learned sitting at the feet of John. If you wondered if John described Jesus in a simpler way, you could just ask Ignatius, what does John say about Jesus? And because we have Ignatius's letters, we can actually see how he describes Jesus. We'll see if he describes Jesus in a much less miraculous way. Then, of course, we don't have anything from Papias, unfortunately. We do know he wrote something, because Eusebius says, but we don't have those documents. But we do have something from Polycarp. And in these letters from Polycarp and Ignatius, you can see that they are quoting. They are quoting New Testament documents or alluding to New Testament concepts. And this means that that information is out there early. And we can look at that information to see if it's less miraculous. Now, we can go from this chain of custody to the next link. The next link, for example, is a guy named Irenaeus, who is the pupil of Ignatius and Polycarp. So if we wonder what it was Ignatius and Polycarp then transmitted forward in history, we could read the letters of Ignatius, and there are a ton of these. And so he actually makes many references to what is now in the New Testament, but he even has a list, for example, of 24 books he's using with his students. Don't let anyone tell you that the gospel, the New Testament canon is somehow collected and first described in some church council. That's not true. It's actually collected much earlier, hundreds of years earlier, and eventually is just confirmed by a church council. The councils don't create the canon. The councils simply confirm the canon that's already in use. So here we can see if the story of Jesus is changing over time. Now, Irenaeus has a student named Hippolytus, and he gets into some trouble. He ends up dying in custody, but he also quotes New Testament concepts and verses from the New Testament and has his own list of New Testament books. Now, here I'm going to say that Origen is said to have heard Hippolytus preach at one time. I wouldn't call Origen necessarily a student of Hippolytus, so we will stop right here. But remember, if this link in the chain matches the link we have today, if the first link in the chain matches the description we have today, you know that it hasn't changed over time. So we don't need a full chain of custody to know that we have a good sequence of events. But we do have longer chains of custody in Cold Case Christianity. I draw these two. Here is the link from Paul all the way down to Tatian. We also have a good link in teacher-student relationship as links in the chain all the way from Peter through the North African church to Eusebius. But my point is, if you lost all of the eyewitness accounts, the gospel accounts, and all you had left were the students of eyewitnesses, you'd be stuck with the same Jesus you have today, because he never changes. Any description you have, as early as you want to go in history, is the same robust, miraculous description. Look, you're not going to be able to argue that somehow there was a version of the Jesus story that was less miraculous than the one you have today, because there is absolutely no evidence of that. Every description of Jesus includes the stuff that most naturalists would find offensive because they don't believe in miraculous or supernatural events. But let me also just add one thing that we need to be teaching our congregations and anyone with whom we are describing the Bible. Look, we don't have original manuscripts. We just don't. So if you were to look at the Gospel of John, for example, well, you don't have an early manuscript of John. You don't have this is something that Bart Ehrman describes in his books. He was shaken by the fact that we don't have an autograph, the original version of any gospel manuscript. We don't have an original of any New Testament book. As a matter of fact, we don't have, as Bart would say, the first copy of the original, or a copy of the first copy of the original, or a copy of a copy of a copy of the first copy of the original. By the time we get a copy, it's sometimes like 3 centuries later. So, and when we compare the most ancient manuscripts we have, they don't match. They don't match. They differ in thousands of places. This is why he says you can't trust anything. I want to address that claim. I don't think most of our people in our churches even know that we don't have originals. They think we have like a copy like you have of the Constitution of the United States, the original sitting in our glass somewhere. That's not the case. They need to know that. And they need to know that there are variations between the accounts. So I typically will show them. Here's a page from the Gospel of John. Now I've increased this 4 times larger because you wouldn't be able to see anything on the page. So what I'm saying is on one page of your Bible, there are actually 4 times this much information. So whatever I show you here is actually 4 times worse than I'm about to show you. So let me show you, for example, what one variation looks like. So in this version, this is the ESV, it is written this way: I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. This is Jesus responding to questions about why he is not entering into Jerusalem yet. And there's another ancient, this is how it is translated and how it is written in the ESV. So those translators decided as a committee that they would write it this way. But there is another equally ancient manuscript that has a competing narrative. It doesn't say this. It says, I am not yet going up to this feast. Now, I grant you that's only a 1-word change. And even Bart would say that 99.9% of all these variations are just like this. They are 1-word or 2-word variations, and none of them have any impact on meaning. None of them change the nature of Jesus. None of them change or challenge any orthodox doctrine of Christianity. So they are just like this. But I just want you to see them because there are many of them on this page. Here's another one. The ESV translation says, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? There's another ancient manuscript that says it's slightly different. It says it knows his letters. Well, that's really means the same thing. So again, no challenge to meaning or to the nature of Jesus, but there's a variation here. By the way, your ESV has the ESV has a footnote that tells you that this variation exists. We just don't read our footnotes very often. But I just wanted you to see this, okay? Here's another one, for example, in the same page. And this one, it says, if anyone is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. This is Jesus speaking. Well, there's another early variation in the manuscripts that says his will. Okay, not a lot. But I wanted you...
Looks like he's still diving into other topics. But we can keep watching if you want. Were you able to hear that all right?
Yeah.
Oh.
I wanted to bring up something here. I think I can illustrate better than talk about it. Is, he's talking about different manuscripts and so on that been passed along. But there's something else that's significant, is you have new converts all the time coming through. And say, we'll just use, for example, a 20-year-old convert that lives to be, say, 70 years old. Okay, so you've got a convert here who's 70 years old. Okay, another one here that's converted, say, this time, lives that same time span. And this next one, say, similar time span. this one, maybe not so long, and so on and so forth. And so any change that is brought up is gonna be refuted by these people that were living and had seen this. So not only do you have the actual transcripts, you have the testimony of these disciples as they learn and as they grew up, and they would reject any change that was made in the writings. So that in itself is a testament that it hasn't been brought up. Just the actual testimony and experience of the disciples as they're reading and looking at these other translations and the other scribes that are writing. There's a test to each one of those just from the experience of the other disciples.
That's good.
What did
Yeah,
they
thanks,
do
Scott.
when they were originally writing this on parts when Papayas, when they're doing that, and they're never miss a word, miss something, they don't have white out.
Well,
But they just scratch that initial it, or,
that's a good question. And it,
I mean, none of them use
Yeah.
pencils, they were all using ink, and try to get it
Yeah.
right the first time, or.
it's a good question. I know there are mistakes. I don't know if any where they scratch it out, like initial, like we would a ballot or something, but I'll have to look that up. And then the originals we don't have, so we don't know if they made mistakes or not, but being that they were inspired, you know,
One try.
yeah. But, and this is, what he was talking about was kind of on topic, but some of that's also later chapters too, so. But when he was talking about different words, so here's an example. So in different translations we have, some will say Christ Jesus, so Jesus Christ, or Messiah, Jesus Messiah. They'll be back and forth because the placement of the word in Greek doesn't matter, it makes no difference. So that would be an example of quote a difference or a change, but really it means the same thing. Lots of those, and including what he was talking about here.
So they're saying people explain to you that it's not reliable because it don't match. Exactly.
Right. Yep.
Even though they use that.
Yeah, and that's I wrote this talking about. And like he was mentioning, and what J. Ward Wallace was saying is, you know, we have the different copies from all throughout time. Originals we don't have, but we have testimony from the immediate students and disciples of the actual apostles. We have those. And then anywhere throughout history, here, they all say the same thing and they all match. So it's
And there
very,
are many copies.
and a wealth of them. Some would say an embarrassment of riches. And that's New Testament. Old Testament, we have old copies as well, like the old Dead Sea Scrolls and whatnot. Those are, I think it's a couple hundred years previous, 300 BC. I saw one recently that was even where this is 0. They have some metal scrolls they found, and it was some old site. I forget what the site was, but they were silver scrolls. They're really small. They were like on a necklace, and they had part of the Old Testament on them. And I think those are dated back. It was 700 or something.
So instead of 66 books, they had 66 scrolls they could
No,
pull down.
they didn't have the New Testament yet. So. But it's very interesting. I talk a lot about Mormons because I think That's what I think I like to do, study other world religions. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, claimed that he was told by angels that our Bible and our scriptures have changed, have been tweaked, and they're no longer reliable. The church is doing it wrong. So he got new revelation. That's the book of Mormon. Well, at what point did it change? Because we can go all the way back. The early first century from the New Testament and multiple centuries previous to the Old Testament. And they all match. So what are you talking about? Right? I always thought that was kind of interesting. But if you don't know the history, you're just going to believe the Trump.
Yeah, and I think that, here's just kind of another thing to go along with this, is as things came about, it wasn't just this, it was, you know, there's more and more and more writings and copies and stuff as time went on. And so it's not like you could change this one because you got this, and this. You know, because
Like that video left, right?
yeah.
Here, look at like on a map back then. So we have, I was thinking, yeah, what's that like the middle? Europe, Russia, Asia, Middle East, Africa, yeah, right?
Looks like we grew from eyeglass world.
Yeah. So, you know, it started, you know, in the Middle East, but it spread throughout the world. And so you have copy here, copy here, copy here, copy here. And then they're making tons of copies everywhere. So if one guy makes a copy here, he can't go across the world and make copies elsewhere. So, yeah,
That's where really the inspiration, we have to believe that the word of God was inspired. And when people were making copies, you know, I kind of believe that. I know there's little changes and sometimes I question about that, but that if our God is truly a God of the universe that can speak things in, he would make sure his word was transcribed in the Middle East and then maybe in Russia or maybe in Rome. I think he would hold his word holy and make sure that it was transcribed correctly.
Yeah.
Now, it may not be 100%, you know, when you consider all the people, but I just think that there's God's hand has to be in this for us, you know, where he can say there's 10,000 fragments that basically say the same thing.
Well, there's a lot of words that have different meaning in different countries
Yeah.
right now.
Mm-hmm.
Chips and crisp things to the Brits.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
When
yeah.
I went over there, I ordered the wrong item.
So,
It's nice to know ahead of time.
So since a little off topic, but kind of along this line is, right, so they have all these different copies everywhere throughout the world. Every place in the world is different. They have different cultures and different dialects and filters and words. And at the time, say, of King James, they had a Byzantine text, and the Textus or Septus, which means the received text, different Greek versions. That's all they had, and they only came from like a couple areas. That's all they had. Now with archaeology, for the last couple hundred years, right, we found a lot more copies. Right? And that's called the common text. So like we saw 2 weeks ago about the adulterous woman, how that's found in some and not others. That would be an example because the text that they use in King James came from only certain areas. That would be a change. But the common text, where we have tens of thousands, or elsewhere.
I think one thing you touched on is, you know, belief in God and in his word requires faith. Always be a choice for us to believe or not believe. And so I think there's never gonna be an absolute concrete established beyond question proof. Always requires faith. And so I think that God has produced something that we can believe in, that is reliable and trustworthy, but yet leaves room for a person to make a choice, whether or not they're gonna believe that. So that's just my own thought. That makes sense, anybody?
Oh, yeah, yeah. There's not, the word proof and like 100% proof, there's not proof for anything. I mean, how do you know you're just not imagining it in your head and you're just in your own world like the Matrix or something?
And when the parent have some small tribes and everybody, did that happen before, after?
Before, after,